Hello and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And today I want to talk about chapters because they seem like they are absolutely essential, and in some books they can be. But ultimately, what it comes down to is a chapter is an entirely artificial division of a narrative. It goes to organizing structure for the reader. That's what a chapter is. Chapters ultimately are not necessary. So when we think about how narrative is structured, particularly written narrative, words are built into sentences, sentences are built into paragraphs, paragraphs are built into scenes, and scenes are built into chapters. Except you can have an entire novel with no chapters, whereas just a sequence of scenes. You don't need chapters. So what are they there for? And ultimately, it comes down to what I've talked about before about a perception of pacing for the reader. Because if you take any of your favorite novels, including some maybe by Sir Terry Pratchett that have no chapter divisions or that have chapter divisions, and just remove the chapter divisions, just remove the words like chapter 10, chapter 12, and look at how they do scene divisions within the novel and just put in a scene division. And lo and behold, you've done nothing to the structure of the narrative. It still flows from the previous scene into the new scene, but instead of it being divided up with a big signifier saying chapter 12, it, it now just goes into the next scene. And so you've changed nothing about the flow of the narrative. You've changed nothing about the structure of the narrative. You've changed nothing in terms of the narrative content. So, why do we think that chapters are so essential? Why do we talk about, oh, well, that chapter was too long? That chapter was too short. Oh, this needed more chapters. Focusing on chapters in that way is so strange because the chapter is too long. But what about the scenes within it? Did the scenes within it work? Oh, yeah, they worked. So why is the chapter? Well, it was a very long chapter. It was 40 pages long. No chapter should be that long. But what does it matter how long the chapter is? Because I like to read one chapter before I go to bed, and this kept me up later. Like, right, but you don't have to read the full chapter. You could have stopped at the end of one of the scenes, put in your bookmark. Well, yes, but then I wouldn't have read the chapter. We build chapters up as this really sort of important way of dividing up a novel. And the thing is, some authors do use them that way. Authors can use chapters as a way to signal a switch from one narrative perspective to another narrative point of view, particularly if they're using multiple points of view. So that's a really handy way of denoting that change. Other authors use chapters to signal that they are moving from one sort of consideration into a different consideration. So if the previous chapter had been all about following the repercussions of something, then the next chapter could be the start of something new, looking at new instigating events. That it's a way of dividing up content. And much like how long should a sentence be, there's no there's no good answer to how long should a chapter be because it's all going to be dependent on the content. It's all going to be dependent on what you're trying to do with it. But the reason I discuss it in terms of it helps the reader in terms of pacing. If you read a short chapter, so one that's only 4 pages long, and you finish that chapter, and then you read another chapter and it's 4 pages long, you go, I've just read 2 chapters. It feels like a lot, even though you've just read 8 pages of text. Whereas if you've read one chapter and the chapter's 40 pages long, you go, I've only read one chapter, but you've read 40 pages of text. And it's that sort of trick that our brains play on us. When you go to buy something and it's $1.99 or £1.99, you go, oh, at least it's not £2 or $2, because that 1 cent is all important. And the thing is, people realize that we do this, that we do think that 1.99 is a lot cheaper than two, even though logically our brains would, sort of go, no, it is literally only a tiny bit cheaper. But because the number at the front is smaller, that's the big number, and we think that's important. So in some respects, chapters are kind of like this. They are a way that we measure our progress as readers. And the bigger the number that we get through, the more impressive we think it is, the more progress we think we are making. And therefore, we perceive it as making progress through a narrative in terms of chapter number, instead of thinking about it in terms of the number of scenes, the developments that are occurring, that the number of chapters suddenly becomes paramount. And some authors really play into this. They have lots of very, very short chapters. Why do it that way? Why not just use those as scenes within a larger chapter? Because of this perception of pace. It makes it feel faster, even though it isn't any faster. It is literally not any faster. You're reading the words at the same pace. You are moving through the narrative at the same rate. You've moved through the scenes at exactly the same rate. You've covered the same amount of content. But because that number of chapter is going up, you feel that you're making more progress. And it's this bizarre thing as a reader. And authors, of course, will manipulate that. So if we think of the major reasons why you subdivide up a novel, one is to group together points of view. If you're using multiple points of view, you can group the scenes that have that point of view all together, and you call that a chapter. And you can have a nice sequence of events all with one point of view. And then when you want to switch point of view, you switch to a different chapter. That makes sense. We can have it as a group of scenes located in the same geographical area. So if you think about a novel in which there are multiple lands, let's say Song of Ice and Fire, one of those books, where you have Westeros and Essos. If the scene is happening in King's Landing, and you have a whole load of scenes in King's Landing, then it makes sense to have all of those in one chapter, that this is the sequence of events here. And then when you want to move to a different location, you go, aha, I will take a new chapter. And that divides up the narrative. The reader goes, oh, now we're somewhere else. It's sort of like a very strong scene divide. Another way of doing it is if you're going to swap temporal locations, if you're going to be playing around with the chronology. So moving to a different time period, you might want to signal that movement with a new chapter. If you have a sequence of scenes that are focused on a particular element, be it a theme or something that is occurring, and you want to show that one event or that one theme from multiple perspectives all at one time, then you can do that in one chapter. And then when you move on to a different event or a different theme, that can be in a different chapter. So you can see how chapter divisions in that sense are being used to group like with like, to give a sort of concrete box around a particular thing. But that doesn't sort of change anything about the perception of pacing. Longer chapters, because of our perception of it, we view as slower than shorter chapters. It's just the way our brains are wired. It's a really weird thing, but that's what it is. And so an author can manipulate the reader this way. So I've already spoken before about how using lots of short sentences can increase the feeling of pace. So having a number of short chapters also does that. Short sentences, short paragraphs, short scenes, short chapters. These are all ways to accelerate the feeling of pace. Longer chapters, so longer sentences, longer paragraphs, longer scenes, longer chapters. These are all ways of slowing down the perception of pace and making it feel longer. And so that is a structural element that an author can bring in to manipulate our perception of the pacing of a narrative. And so at the end of the day, chapters are not necessarily entirely arbitrary. There are reasons for their use, but they are not necessary for a narrative. They are an artificial intrusion of a narrative structure for one of any number of different reasons. But they are an artificial intrusion of structure into a narrative that is not necessary, but does carry with it certain effects. And knowing what those effects are, knowing how those effects can be manipulated, that is the important thing. So if anyone ever says, how long should a chapter be? How long should a piece of string be? It depends on what you're going to be using it for. Chapters are not necessary. The words are, the sentences are, the paragraphs are, the scenes are. But we know that you can have a best-selling novel that has no chapters, it just has scene breaks. Much the same way, you can actually write an entire story in stream of consciousness that has no proper punctuation. It's possible. Doesn't mean it's always desirable, because having the punctuation, having chapters can make it easier for a reader to break up the narrative into digestible chunks. But thank you very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I will see you in the next one.